How do you talk about a game with DLC? I'm not talking about DLC like that horse armor garbage. I'm talking about like Dark Souls 2 level shit. And much like Dark Souls 2, I'm struggling to formulate my opinions on Control because of the difference between the DLC and the base game. Dark Souls 2 overall has a, let's call it mixed opinion among the fan base. Despite that though, many who had problems with the base game ended up loving the 3 DLC expansions. And I'm in the same boat with Control. After finishing the base game, I knew I wanted to do a video on the game and started writing before taking on its 2 DLCs. I got over 2,000 words in my original script with the main thesis being the game is a mixed bag. I had a good time, but I had a fair amount of issues ranging from the pacing to the writing. But after finishing the first DLC, The Foundation, I couldn't bring myself to finish that script because the DLC had altered my perspective on the game so much. So we returned to my original question: how do you talk about a game with DLC? My natural instinct is to throw the game a bone and judge based on the whole, or at the very least, give it some extra points for a good expansion. But DLCs like Controls usually require you to make it through the majority of the game in order to access them. Going off Steam achievement stats, only about 30% of players actually beat the base game, which is required to access the Foundation. How much credit can I really give a game when a majority of players won't even make it that far? So rather than reviewing Control and its DLC together, I want to compare and contrast the 2 sides of the game to hopefully get a better understanding of the whole. I want to start off by going over the problems I had with the base game to give a baseline for when talking about the DLC. There's still a lot that I think the base game does really well, but to avoid making the same points twice, I'll save most of that for when I get to the DLC. But one of the issues I had that doesn't get addressed in the DLC is the mod system. I was already baffled at its inclusion when I first encountered it in the game, and finishing the 2 expansions really nailed home how useless this system is. The game has randomly generated mods that can be equipped to your gun and person that boost certain stats by percentages. I realize the system is there for additional progression and customization, as well as adding additional reasons to explore the environment, but they just feel so out of place. It bogs down the game having to sort through and deconstruct all these garbage mods, especially in a pretty linear story-driven experience like this is. This isn't some MMO, I don't care about grinding or trying to craft the best mods. But because the system is so baked into the base game, the devs added more types of mods rather than overhauling the original system, which is understandable. Sticking with mechanical issues though, combat is not perfect. The combat system as a whole is one of my favorite parts of Control, but it still has its flaws. The most glaring of which is the pacing. Combat is very hectic and chaotic, which I do find to be enjoyable a lot of the time. The recharging ammo and energy bars being separate push you towards cycling between gunplay and telekinetic abilities, and enemies dying being the main source of healing also pushes you to play more aggressively. And it's a great time when the powers like launch feel so good to use. But the chaotic fun comes with some caveats that the base game doesn't always handle very well. Some enemies can dish out a lot of damage really quickly, and sometimes you just get blindsided by some frustrating deaths because there's so much going on at once. This doesn't really come up too much because a lot of battles are short enough to mitigate those issues, but the end of the game throws that straight out the window with some of the very long drawn out sequences. These longer battles increase the odds that you'll get caught off guard by some bullshit and can be frustrating getting 2-shot by some guy you didn't even see. And on top of that, it becomes mentally taxing to have to be focused in for that long. By the end of the last combat stretch, I was sick of it, and it is a big reason why I was able to write so much before getting to the DLC. But to round off my issues with the base game, the writing often left a lot to be desired. I do want to make a clear distinction between the writing and the setting though. The setting of Control truly is one of its best aspects. The dark atmosphere, the SCP-inspired elements, the Cold War era tech, the brutalist architecture, the warping of space, all of it does wonders for the game and really drew me into the world. The writing for the dialogue and plot, however, just didn't really do it for me. Some characters like Dr. Darling and the Board I really enjoyed, but a lot of others are very surface level and have some truly awful lines.
Gonna have to hit those college career fairs, am I right? Huh.
It's hard to imagine the FBC at job fairs.
The cutaways to Jesse's inner thoughts in particular got a lot of groans out of me.
Sounds like you have a plan.
Uh-huh. A simple one. You need to find more tokens and clear the hiss the fuck out of the formation.
That is simple.
Wow, incredible!
And I usually wouldn't care all that much, but when the setting is as interesting as it is, it really pulls me out when characters are making shitty one-liners. It was never enough to ruin the experience for me, and I hope it's coming across that I did enjoy Control's base game. There's a saying that goes something like, people often criticize the things they love most, and Control is a perfect example of this for me. While I don't think the DLCs are perfect, each improves on the base game and the missteps are few and far between. The writing still has its moments, but I found it to be much better overall, partially from a general increase in quality, but also because there's a noticeable decline in the classic video game dialogue. The base game had a lot of moments of bog standard shot, reverse shot to move the story along, and this is where a lot of the groan-inducing lines originate from. While some of that is still present, most of the dialogue and story comes through either in-game with the cool layover effect from characters talking through the Dimension phone, or cutscenes where they're able to do a lot more with the performances, editing, and cinematography. Keeping with the more narrative side of things, I found the overall plots of each DLC to be more interesting as well. I think AWE was a little weaker than the Foundation overall, but the Alan Wake stuff and the central goal of taking out Hartman held it together. But man, the Foundation really was the standout. I was really invested in learning more about the board and the oldest house, and the game does a good job of adding more visual variety to the setting without undermining what made the base game so good. And most importantly, the Foundation was able to walk the fine line of expanding on the source material without explaining away all of the interesting mysteries. And while I didn't comb through every log entry, I did end up reading more than I had in the base game because I wanted to dive deeper into the world. It ended up being much more engaging than listening to Jessie talk about how much she cares about her brother. Where the story got more of a glow up, I really think the combat and game mechanics really got to shine in both expansions. Combat felt so much better overall, with every encounter feeling just about right. Nothing is overly long like the Hedron sequence in the base game. And a smart design decision that further alleviates this problem is the enemy type introduced in the Foundation, the Miners. With an E. Sorry if you're disappointed you don't get to yeet rocks at children. The Miners, or Sharpened as they're referred to in-game, are great because unlike most enemies in the base game, they are melee only and incredibly aggressive. Unlike the Exploders, which can be easily outrun, the Sharpened incentivize you to use more of your tools. I found the Shield Bash to be really effective, and it made me pay more attention to my positioning and the combat arena as a whole. Very good design, gold star. The new auxiliary mechanics were also pretty interesting as well. In the Foundation, you get the ability to break and regrow these crystals throughout the map, and are able to choose which of the two you unlock first. While I didn't find it very useful to use the crystal powers in combat, it was really cool to have the two paths available to take based on which power you picked first, and they were implemented into traversing the environment very nicely. In AWE, you're introduced to a similar mechanic in Alan Wake, where you burn these dark blobs with light sources that you usually pick up with the launch power. It was a little janky when holding the light sources for long periods of time, just due to the haptics going on for so long, but turning them down really just turned it into a non-issue. And obviously, being the RTX game, playing with the light sources really gets elevated because of it. My personal rig isn't quite powerful enough to run the full ray tracing shindig, but it still looks really great without that.
Disgusting!
All in all, the DLCs provide great additions to the mechanical foundation that the base game set up. Now, I wouldn't say that the base game had bad set pieces per se, but I struggle to really recall any that really blew me away. There are still quite a few good ones, mostly linked to the escaped altered items like the fridge and the traffic light, but I think the DLCs work a bit better. The different light puzzles involved with defeating Hartman were pretty interesting. Some were better than others, but they got the job done and made for a nice break from standard combat and boss battles where you just had to shoot and eat shit to win. In particular, I liked how the darkness drained your energy to add in some extra urgency and meant you couldn't just spam dodge while flying around the room. I also have some smaller moments that I thought were good, but there's not really a whole lot to say about them. Areas of the astral plane bleeding into the oldest house were pretty great. There's something about fucked up spatial physics that just get me, and I wish that the base game did a lot more with that. But I guess I can settle for the astral bathroom. The TV altered item was cool even if it was a little janky to use, but using it to stun the higher level enemies as well as being your primary light source was a neat idea. But by far the standout has to be Jesse Faden's starring in Swift Platform. Like a lot of the altered item encounters, you get transported to an area to complete some challenge to cleanse the item. This time being a train sequence where you have to dodge oncoming hazards and deal with enemies, all to a banging soundtrack. It's just goofy enough to be a nice foil to all the darker aspects of the game, but it doesn't go so far to undermine anything. It's a silly little side adventure that took me completely by surprise when I first encountered it, and it lasted just long enough to not overstay its welcome. While I don't think I'll ever be able to truly know how to judge a game when keeping its expansions in mind, I do think Control is a prime example of how to do expansions right. Add interesting new areas to explore, add interesting mechanics that expand on what was already done, and focus on what made the base game great. I don't think I've ever had such a drastic shift in perspective on a game before, and for anyone who hasn't played Control, I do recommend it if anything I talked about sounded interesting. Despite the issues I have with the game, the parts that do work really shine, and it's one of those games that really takes playing it yourself to get the full experience. Thanks to everyone for watching. If you've played Control, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. For those who haven't, has there been a game that got better with DLC? Perhaps it got worse? Let me know in the comments. There's some buttons above the description if you liked what you saw or want to see more from me. And with that, I'll see you in the next one.